Hello and welcome to Public Affairs Public Access on Houston Media Source TV. I'm Linda Cohn with the League of Women Voters. This evening we're going to go on a conversational stroll through one of our favorite chapters in the great American story, women's suffrage, women and the vote. Our little piece of the narrative this evening will focus on President Woodrow Wilson. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was the President of the United States from 1913 through 1921, and it was during his administration that women achieved the right to vote. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, was approved, adopted, and proclaimed in 1920. And Mr. Wilson was, of course, very much a part of the political and moral calculus that swirled about our beloved Amendment 19. Please call us with your questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you and learn your point of view. The number is 713-807-1794. That's 713-807-1794. With us this evening from the University of Houston Downtown, Government and Political Science Professor Dr. David Branham. Also from the University of Houston Downtown, History Professor Dr. Jean Preuss. And we welcome Sarah Sanchez Alarcon, a high school student of history and government and a member of Mi Familia Vota's Youth Leaders Program. Before we get started, Sarah, please tell us just a bit about Mi Familia Vota and their Youth Leader Program.
Okay, I would love to. So Mi Familia Vota is actually a program that targets minority communities and tries to get more civic engagement out of those communities. So as we know, minority communities such as Asian communities, Latino communities, African American communities, they end up having a lot less engagement in terms of whether they go out to vote or whether they organize. So Mi Familia Vota focuses on those groups, and we try to get them more aware of the politics of the community and state and federal governments.
And as a youth leader, I understand that you're engaged in a very special academic program, combining high school and an associate degree is coming your way. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I am part of this dual enrollment program. So I am from East Early College High School. So part of graduating with my high school diploma also entails having an associate's degree from Houston Community College because we share the same campus. So I'll actually be graduating with my associate's degree before I graduate with my high school diploma.
How many classes have you taken? About how many classes have you taken in history or politics?
I've taken several, from anthropology and archaeology, which is just like the basis of understanding human culture, to several U.S. history classes at the college level. And I'm about to take economics and government this coming year.
We're very happy to have you with us this evening.
Thank you.
Now on to Mr. Wilson. His presidency is perhaps best remembered for the federal income tax, for World War I, and for a venture into a League of Nations. But we're going to start at the beginning. The man who became President Wilson was born in Staunton, Virginia in 1856, and he spent the first 24 years of his life there, including the Civil War years. Mr. Wilson was most certainly a man of the South. He once said of his hometown, I'm going to read you this quote, that it was, quote, the only place in the world where nothing has to be explained to me. That's a pretty powerful statement. Perhaps part of that conservative Southern package was why Mr. Wilson stood firmly opposed to women's suffrage, consistently saying that it would bring about social changes that would have very disagreeable effects. Jean Preuss, tell us about what it was like in small-town Virginia in the middle of the 1800s.
Well, you know, we look at the role of women and the environment in which Woodrow Wilson grew up. it was a very different time than it is today. Women had kind of what we would call a sphere of influence. And the sphere of influence that most women were allowed, everybody had their own roles. And the women's role was predominantly caretaker, helpmeet, and mother. So if you were outside of those roles, society kind of looked at you askance. They thought that you were behaving outside of your role, and you were scandalous, right? You needed to be corrected. Now, I will say something about Thomas Woodrow Wilson. Tom Wilson was his dad was a minister, a preacher, and they actually spent several years, about 10 years in Augusta, Georgia.
Augusta, Georgia, yes.
Augusta, Georgia. It's right on the South Carolina border, right across the river. And their house that they lived in, the parsonage, is now open. It's a historical site. And this past March, my wife and I, my mother-in-law, were there, and we spent a couple of hours touring the house. Beautiful. But it was a parsonage, but it was a Southern parsonage. His father, and this is available on the internet, gave a very famous defense of slavery. It was, speaking of roles, the roles for African Americans in the South was that of subservient. They were second-class citizens, if at the best. Even free blacks were not treated well, didn't have full rights. So it was a different time, a different place, and it was a place that that certainly shaped his view. I think one of the things that we saw at the house that was very telling, as a small boy, he was typical of young children. He did a lot of drawing, and they preserved some of that. And he was also a baseball fanatic, and he had a baseball team that he put together. And so he had these sketches when he should have been in school taking notes. He wouldn't have been in early college. He was drawing and plotting out who was going to play in the roster for his baseball team and whatnot. But one of the things that he saw at the beginning of the Civil War in the 1860s, he witnessed a train carrying wounded soldiers prisoners of war, Northern soldiers coming in on the train. And he drew a picture in his school notes of this, and they've got this picture there. And you think about that. Here was a young man who at an early age saw the ravages and the destruction of war, and as president ran on a campaign in 1916 saying, we'll never go to war, and within a year they were.
Let's be perfectly clear about this. The Wilson family were not merely geographical Southerners. They were slaveholders. I believe
his father was a slaveholder.
His father was a slaveholder. And in the house where they lived, they have the slave servants' quarters and whatnot there, so yes.
And I believe his father, the minister, actually was one of the founding members of the Southern Presbyterian Church in the United States, which came into being because it was splitting from the rest.
You know, we tend to think
of the group
over
slavery.
About the Civil War and how the North split from the South, but it was actually the cleavages were much deeper and spread across society. The churches split. This is why we have a Southern Baptist congregation and a Northern Baptist or an American Baptist congregation. The Presbyterians and other churches split on the basis of slavery before the Civil War began. And this was part of the cleave in the nation's fabric that would later on emerge. People have been talking about splitting since the 1820s and 30s and 40s. So, we talk about the Civil War and how it happened. It wasn't sudden. It was long planned. And his father, and it's available on the internet, gave this speech, the traditional Southern minister's speech, a Christian defense, if you will, for slavery, and quoting from the Bible why slavery was part of God's plan. And so that was his mindset growing up.
Yeah. Politically, what was happening in that part of the South at that time?
Well, at that time, I mean, if you look at the Civil War itself and the Lincoln Lincoln presidency and actually the election of 1860. You see, there was 4 candidates who actually were running.
And bearing in mind, if we need to backtrack for just a second,
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson would have remembered this.
Oh,
It would have
course,
been
yeah.
within his memory.
I think he was born in 1851.
54,
Yeah.
1854.
So he would have remembered
He
this.
was about, like, 9
politics
years
was
old.
there was no
Yeah.
question that politics was on the dinner table menu.
Well, if you think about Abraham Lincoln and him being opposition to slavery, Lincoln won 2 counties out of 1,000 in the South. 2. 998 counties went to presidents who are more receptive to slavery. So, I mean, you think about the time that Woodrow Wilson grew up and what his father believed. He himself became a Presbyterian minister himself later, part of that split. So, I mean, it was ingrained, and this is something that stayed with him his whole life. It was something that when Gene talks about slavery, to me is something that he didn't want to let go of. He let go more of the women's suffrage thoughts that he had. He was much more receptive later on to women's suffrage than he was early on. When it comes to slavery and segregation, even in his own Department of Treasury, he maintained segregation.
There's a famous, to follow up on what you're saying, there's a famous incident. There's a movie that was based upon Thomas Dixon's book, The Klansman. It was called Birth of a Nation. The movie version, it's a famous film, famous in the history of filmmaking. It was the first time they put a camera on a truck bed, and there's a scene where the Klansmen are riding heroically to save this poor woman from being ravaged by, what they would have called a mulatto at the time. It was a silent movie, but it was they were talking about the perils of Reconstruction, how the blacks had taken over. And so the Klan goes riding in to essentially lynch this man. And they're riding in, and it's the first time that the motion picture used a moving camera. And so it's historically famous film, but it is horribly racist.
It's very
Wilson
disturbing.
showed
It
it.
is.
Wilson screened it at the White House. And in his description of it, he said it was history written in lightning. He believed that to be the case and it to be a fairly accurate Hollywoodized version. I mean, they didn't think of Hollywood as the way we think of it today. But he thought it was an accurate portrayal of what the South went through.
Yeah, and yet this child of the South went on to receive a fairly liberal education.
He
Well,
did.
he was
And
an
he was-
educated person. He went to Princeton University.
Well, Gene was talking
And
about
John Hopkins.
John
and-
Hopkins.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was talking about how he liked to draw pictures. He was dyslexic, so he didn't even start to learn to read till he was 10 years old. And he learned shorthand and things like that, to get around that. So he had a learning disability early on, and from there he was very strong-willed.
Here's my question. When do we start seeing some cracks in that traditional Southern philosophy of life?
That's a really good question.
We're talking about someone when he did get to Princeton and he became president of Princeton University. One of the things that he did was do away with the elite dining clubs. He tried to
Yeah.
open up campus life in a more, dare we use the term, egalitarian way.
Well-
he hired Jews and he hired Roman Catholics.
Yeah,
Maybe that foreshadowed his appointment of Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish person to sit on the
appointed him,
Supreme Court.
yes.
Something was cooking there.
So I would say, first of all, he comes out of the South. His father was educated, right? His parents, they were well off for their time, and they were educated. His father was educated. So he was a little bit different from the average, Southern, the kind of the stereotypical image of the Southerner. Education wasn't widespread in the South. It really wasn't widespread in the North, but it was more spread than it was in the South prior to the Civil War. And, he came from a family whose class could have afforded it. And so that afforded him a broader mindset. And I think being at the university and getting the college background and being around different people, he probably had a broader outlook. Now, look, another thing is he is the first president ever to leave the White House and go on a state trip abroad, and he went to Europe after World War I to wrap things up. But at the same time, so I mean, he is a man of many firsts and a president of many firsts. But you know, there's also some limitations to his historical record. And so, right, he did appoint Brandeis, but at the same time, he was a racist. You know, by today's standards, he was a racist.
Trying to figure this out is very perplexing for a number of reasons. But you mentioned something, you two gentlemen mentioned something that might provide a clue. This was the dawn of a new academic era, of new professional associations, where maybe people from all parts of the country, from the land-grant schools to the Ivy League elites, could meet on common ground and discuss their disciplines.
He transformed education at Princeton.
Tell us, David.
Well, you think about...
Tell us what was happening during that time that maybe Woodrow Wilson got a whiff of.
Well, his time as president at Princeton, it was, you know, I think he surrounded himself...
Which was the late 1800s.
Yeah, he surrounded himself with people he had never seen before. And even though his father was educated and was from the South, he's now in the North. He's now in New Jersey. He gets a whole different mindset coming at him. He faces a lot of opposition from the faculty, but at the same time, he has a lot of power as president. I think he raised the faculty number by like 60% when he was there. And he did incredible things as far as developing the money and the endowments that were coming into the university. So while he was the president of Princeton, you know, he had these views, but at the same time, when, you know, Gene and I were talking about discussions we have at the university on a daily basis, where we actually are going back and forth a lot, he had to do that there. And that meant that he had to see different viewpoints. And you can see this later in his writings when he talks about public administration and the government of the United States, that it's important for us to be more tolerant of different opinions, because if we can't, then we're not going to be able to have an efficient government. We're not going to have a way of doing it. For instance, he wanted to move to a parliamentary type of system so that we wouldn't elect the president. And
was he an Anglophile? Would you call him that?
Well, I'm going to let you call him.
Well, I'll ask the question, but I won't answer it. Skipping ahead a few years,
okay.
How did that make him a little bit more eager to jump into World War I?
Well, we were pretty, you know...
We were all Anglophiles.
We were all Anglophiles. I mean, but look, where was the... I mean, this was a time before the internet, a time before texting and you know, CNN and immediate news coverage. It was a time when you relied upon whoever was reporting the news and the news traveling across the ocean. So we got news several days late. And because of submarine warfare, because of everything, where was the news coming from? It was coming from England. So we were a little predisposed to getting their side of the story. Now, we were big trading partners with them, even at that point. We were and you know, Wilson tried to maintain a well, not really an isolation, but a middle of the road. He thought we should be kind of a naive attitude is sometimes described, that we're going to be neutral, so that means we could trade with Germany, we can trade with Italy, we can trade with England, and we're everybody's friend. Well, that's not how they saw it, right? They saw if you're, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and if you're trading with my enemy, then you must be my enemy too.
If you look at his 14 points, right, 9 of them, it's 14 points on foreign policy, on how to conduct foreign policy. 9 of them have to do with territory, right? He was often, his viewpoint was, stay out of everybody else's territory, leave them alone.
Well, this was kind of the beginning of the end of the great empires.
Yes.
And the great empires in Europe and Asia. And
did not have
places.
distaste for that.
And the United States as well. He was kind of an imperialist as well.
Sure.
But the great empires had been built since the 1860s and 70s. And were expanding, and this had led, the common attitude is that this is what had led to the war. And I think most historians would agree that that still is one of the big causes of the war.
We're going to jump back to the younger Mr. Wilson as president of Princeton University, later governor of New Jersey. The progression there seems a little bit more natural. But by then he had pretty much embraced the entire progressive palette, labor law reforms, education expansion. of those opportunities. Election purity legislation, keeping the ballot box secure, but he didn't move 1 inch on women's suffrage.
No, that's a very good point. So let me bring up something that most people don't connect the dots on. In 1900, September, just a few miles south of here was one of the largest and most costly natural disasters in our history, and that was the Galveston hurricane, which had come up through Cuba and other places and hit us as well. At least 6,000 deaths that we know of. Out of that came the Galveston Plan, or the Texas Plan, as it was sometimes called. And this was city government reform. It was it drew national attention. This idea that rather than having, I like to say, if you get elected mayor, well, you're going to appoint your cousin Bob or, lazy cousin Albert to be, to give him a job and stuff. No, what they were going to do was they were going to hire experts, people who were, if you had been a policeman, then you could be police commissioner because you had experience and knowledge of that field. And so this commission form of government, 1900, Teddy Roosevelt as president pushed that. It was a time of a lot of government reform. You talked about what was called at the time good government league, right? This idea of good government. How do you get good government? Well, you don't let people who don't know how to vote, right? You control the vote. Now, how does that turn out? It turns out in race-related voting rules, right? So if you are poor, if you are African American or other minority groups, well, you have to pay. Everybody has to pay a poll tax. Well, and if you're one of those minority groups or impoverished, that's going to be very difficult. But it's to control the vote, so the best people are voting, hopefully electing the best people. It sounds good on paper.
It comes from a mindset of that certain people aren't capable of basically having a good life for themselves, so we have to make decisions for them.
And women were included in that.
Women were included in that. Minorities for sure were included in that. And you look in Texas, I mean, even after the Civil War and you had the amendments come through to give voting rights, they did everything in their power in Texas and other southern states to make sure that the status quo stayed. And basically the elites would run things. And it's still, we still have a traditionalistic culture here where the elites are more likely to run things. Just a law that says you need to wait 30 days between registration and voting. That's unusual in a lot of states. A lot of states let you register and vote on the same day. But that's part of what I think Dr. Preuss is talking about, where what we want is an elitist system where certain people who are smart enough to vote are the ones making the decisions. And he definitely had that mindset. Woodrow Wilson had that mindset. You can see it in his writings on administrative efficiency. He did want professionalism. I mean, Jacksonian spoil systems were not what he was interested in. He wanted government to be efficient. He wanted government to do well. And part of doing well was not letting people run government
and
who weren't qualified.
At last, I can see a coherent theme running through his life.
Yes.
I know what's best for you, and I'm going to make you do it whether you want to or not.
Well, I would say that you could even see that in the League of Nations.
Yeah.
Okay.
In his.
Yeah.
But let me also bring in something else that's going with this, right? As Dr. Brandon was talking about, you want the best people voting because they're going to make the best decisions. But this idea of the best people, there was a philosophy that came out around the 1870s, what we today call social Darwinism. And this idea that there are some cultures, there are some groups, there are some people that are simply better than others and have advanced better. So this is, they believed that Africans were not fully evolved, not fully developed. And so that's why slavery had been okay. Because one of the things they said, look, is that slavery, we civilized them. And they felt the same way about Latin Americans. They felt the same way about Filipinos. They felt, this was the time of the World's Fair in Chicago. They had the White City, the Alabaster City in downtown Chicago, and where they brought in Filipino different tribes of Filipinos, all the way from what they might have considered Aboriginal, all the way to the civilized people. Native Americans were on the decline, but at the same time we were educating them, and Richard Henry Pratt in Pennsylvania at his academy said, we are going to kill the Indian and save the man. So
Wow.
this was the mentality, right, that we could socially engineer, that we could use eugenics, right, to keep the best people and improve society. If you look at the League of Nations, so just jump forward, if you look at the League of Nations, part of, if you understand that mindset, you can see some of that in the 14 points that Wilson came up with. You know, and he is the one, he wanted this to be his victory. We had only been involved in the war about 18 months. And actually, and much of that was training. We got into the war late. We wanted to run things, and we said we saved the war. We probably didn't. We just helped. But we claim credit for it. He's the one who came up with the 14 points. He went to Europe to lobby for it. And when he got back, the Europeans, who were very glad to have him and to have him help, but he didn't find that reception here in the United States. And so he went on this whirlwind tour to demand, let's elect legislators who are going to pass this. You know, we need to control the Senate, who ratified the treaty. And he wanted that control. And it was on this speaking tour that he fell ill, he came back to D.C., and he had a stroke.
Yeah. Sarah, when you study this in your various government and history classes, do you get this level of interpretation, or is it more a strict timeline? How is Woodrow Wilson regarded in present high school and college textbooks? It's been a while since I cracked one of those open.
Well, actually, the way that it's been done recent years, it's that we try to get more of like the person rather than the specific politics. So the way that it's taught in my college classes, we look at it more about the events, specifically going back and forth between timelines, drawing comparisons between like an event that happened in like 1918 and something that like might have happened like in the Civil War. But in regards to President Wilson, what occurred mostly was, or what we heard most of, or just like his politics, we don't really get a sense of like the person other than like their beliefs, a little bit of like when they were born, how they were raised, but it really doesn't like span much more.
Do you feel like you're being cheated? Do you ever run into anyone you would like to learn more about? How did this person get there? Or do you think that the requirements of academia are such that you just have to get that knocked down and the box ticked to move on to something else?
I would say that it's more about knowledge than just like learning about an event. If we want to truly understand what happens, we have to understand the people that were involved, their backgrounds, rather than just the events that occurred. But unfortunately, because of like how much time we have in order to learn about like half of like the United States history, so like 1 semester, 3 months to learn, we really just have to like streamline a lot of the events, go through things very quickly. Although I do wish that it was more about learning about the individual person, learning about what shaped them to have those beliefs, why they were elected, etc.
Did you discuss at all Woodrow Wilson and women's suffrage?
I believe so. We discussed how he was basically very important in having the amendment ratified. Specifically, I believe in 1918 he gave a speech regarding the importance of women, especially during World War I, and how they basically took all of the jobs that men
So you got
had
something,
left.
yeah.
Yes.
You got something there. We'll come to that in a second. One more thing about Woodrow Wilson. While he was in the pre-presidential period, his first wife, Ellen Wilson, was a woman of some independent accomplishment. I don't know that Mr. Wilson was necessarily afraid of strong, intelligent, competent women.
That's true. She was a fine artist. The thing about it, though, is that when she married him, she gave it up.
Yeah.
She gave it up.
That was not uncommon, was it?
Yeah, I mean, she had a new role, as Dr. Preuss was talking about. Her role was no longer to be an accomplished artist. Now,
But she also was Southerner. I believe that was the case.
I don't remember for sure.
I believe she was a woman of Southern heritage as well. But we're really beating up
sorry.
on the South today. But I believe
I'm not trying to beat up on the South.
I believe she also had ministerial background in her family.
That would make
Yes,
sense.
her father was a minister, actually. Yeah, her father was a minister, and there was a period of time after that he met her where she did go off and do her studies, I believe, and develop this. And I believe that she had some illness in her family, and she had to take care of people in her family.
I think it was a suicide. Was that correct?
I think her father committed suicide, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken on this.
Yeah.
But
It was a fraught family. This was a
Yes.
family with a rich and varied and complicated interior life.
And so when she married Wilson, she just basically gave up that and put herself in the role that Dr. Preuss was talking about, of this of somebody who's going to be a caretaker, somebody who's going to take care of the house, somebody who's going to assume the role of the woman in society.
And they did have children, and they were girl children. They were young women children. And the fact that Woodrow Wilson could not see at that time that he would have daughters, of course you want them to be able to vote. Didn't click yet. It didn't click. A little bit. You have to go a little bit further
No, it does.
down the
When
road.
you have children like that, that makes a difference. I mean, I have 13-year-old twins. The day my twins were born, I have a boy and a girl. And so the day my twins were born, I actually picked up my girl and looked at her. I said, "You're going to be president of the United States one day." I didn't do that to my son. But it was just so the mentality could be there that, yeah, this can happen.
But a lot of times, I would also argue that when we look back at history, we often bring our own perspectives. And so I've heard students in classes that I've teach was like, well, why didn't slaves revolt? There were more of them than there were of the white society. Sometimes they did, but not all the time. Why didn't women fight for rights more often? And a lot of times we've got to realize that in that culture that they lived in, that was what they knew. I mean, there was a time that, and as a young person to say this, there was a time that we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have smartphones. That we didn't call people up. We had to use a pay phone. And
go to the library
with a rotary dial. And so we laugh at that because it sounds quaint now. But in those days, you just, if you didn't have that, you weren't exposed to that, you wouldn't think that. And so sometimes I've asked my mom, who she lived in a segregated world. She went to a segregated school. And I said, didn't that bother you? And she goes, that was all we knew. And I think in those times, so he had children, he had daughters, and I'm sure he wanted the best for them. But what did the best for them mean that they would marry well, that they would have good children and raise them and be good mothers and...
A comfortable life.
Right.
But Mr. Wilson saw, he was a man of the world. Even before the presidency now, we'll get to 1912 and the presidential election in a moment. He saw the world. He was in university situations where there were, everyone hold your breath, lady professors.
Were there?
Lady students.
Maybe a few, but
A few.
Again, you had the outliers.
They were the outliers, yes.
And so, while you might have a few people, they were novel.
I mean, I think he hired like about 60 to 65 professors when he was there, and he got to hire them himself. He was the one who made the final picks on these. So even he did have a philosophy, right? In his philosophy was I have to hire the best educators, but there's always bias in that the best educators are the people who know what to do, right? And that's been ingrained in him. It was ingrained in him as a child. I know by his father more than probably anyone else. That this is the way things are supposed to be. Now, he evolved over time, there's no doubt.
He did. Let's talk about the presidential election of 1912, because we haven't seen anything like it
Very interesting,
before
yes.
or since. For the Republicans, William Howard Taft.
Half of them.
The sitting president, known to be opposed to women's suffrage, but not crazily opposed to women's suffrage.
Okay.
He did take seriously the desires of women in his family who told him otherwise, who were lobbying on a personal basis for women's suffrage. He did accept their opinions.
He was a very smart man also.
Indeed, and he was very politically savvy,
Yes.
But that's not the
very
popular
conservative.
opinion of him.
very conservative.
Yes.
But there were lots of folks who remembered an address that President Taft gave to a women's group 2 years before the presidential election of 1912, so it would have been 1910. And the women were not expecting him to come out and endorse a constitutional amendment or even state legislation in support of women's suffrage. They were just expecting a friendly presidential address. And what they got was racial insults, what we would today call sexist insults. He literally said that certain people of color, of a certain gender, were not capable of managing their own affairs, were not capable of voting, needed help of others, so go away and leave me alone. This was not what was expected of a presidential address. So we had President Taft. It was kind of hard to forget that. In fact, and Alice Paul was president, and she was one of the more strident, shall we say, feminists of the time, and she reported that there was an audible hiss in the auditorium because people were clenching their teeth and breathing through their teeth. And you could hear this all at once. And a letter was actually sent to the White House. Talk about time and place and tradition. A letter went out to the White House apologizing for such rudeness among the ladies in the audience while the president was standing there insulting them.
Presidential speeches and campaign have changed quite a bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. But that was William Howard Taft.
But, so I said earlier that, that was in the public perception of Taft. And talking about perceptions, and Taft has gotten a bad rap in history. When I was in
I know,
school,
he's remembered as the big guy of the presidency.
they had to get a brand
right?
new,
Yeah.
they had to get a extra large bathtub.
Do you
to
know the
accommodate
story,
him.
Sarah? Have you heard the story? Close your eyes. Can you visualize William Howard Taft?
Yes, a little.
Very large, interesting mustache, and one of the most brilliant politicians that Ohio has ever produced.
Yeah. But, he weighed about 300, a little over 300 pounds.
He became Chief Justice of the Supreme
Right.
Court after.
Yes.
after his
And-
presidency.
And a distinguished
And
justice
the thing,
as well.
the thing
But
that's
very
said,
conservative. I mean,
well,
strict
the-
interpretation of the Constitution.
you're talking about his wife being smart. It was often said that his wife was the one who wanted him and pushed him to be the Chief Justice and pushed him for that appointment. However, if you look at historically, we often talk about Wilson, Taft, and Theodore Roosevelt.
Teddy.
And I'm backwards. Were
well,
called the progressive presidents because they were the ones of this with a big P, the progressive era presidents. So early 1900s to about till World War I. So that first 18 years. So we often think about Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, right? That he went in there, he established national parks, he did all these great things. He was, the Taft-Hartley Act and
Yes.
the bully,
labor,
all those other wonderful things.
Right.
Panama Canal,
But-
Alaska Railroad.
well,
Just keep those big adventures coming.
right, yeah. This was Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, right? Yeah. But if you look at who actually did more for trust busting, it was Taft. Taft actually, Roosevelt talked a great game. But Taft really implemented a lot more of
What
those.
was the name of that bill?
Taft-Hartley Act.
Yes.
So you see more in Taft. Now, they were overshadowed by the dark horse candidate, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. And actually, the thing about talking about strong women, it was one of the stories we learned is that he went by Tom all his life. He went by Tom Wilson. If you go to the house, still there is a pane of glass where he had taken a knife or something and etched his name Tom, and that's still preserved, many, many long years later. But his mother wrote him a letter once and said, if you're going to be, when he was getting his PhD and whenever he was becoming president, if you're going to go into politics, Thomas is not a dignified name. Go by Woodrow. And so he adapted. Then he started using T. Woodrow Wilson.
Oh.
But so he was a dark horse candidate.
Yeah.
Nobody thought he was going to win.
I mean, he was. I mean, he got on the Democratic nomination on the 96th ballot.
And just to bring it back to women's suffrage, he was mightily avoiding the question of women's suffrage. He was cornered once at a campaign stop in New York City, and a woman in the audience said, "You know, declare yourself one way there." "Oh, I wouldn't. I'm here to talk about a national office.
It was a new.
I'm running for a national office. This is a state issue. Don't bother me. Go away." The woman persisted and was arrested.
That's one of those no-win issues, though, where you don't want to take a position because it hurts you no matter what you say.
So we have Taft, who was opposed. We have Wilson, who dearly hoped that no one could figure out his position.
Right.
And Teddy Roosevelt, who joyfully embraced women's suffrage.
So,
political science people, tell us what happened. What was the outcome of that election?
What happened was, well, if you remember right, Taft and Roosevelt were together on the Republican ticket. In the
At one
previous
time,
election, yeah. What happened was that there was a Republican domination in the country before Woodrow Wilson was elected.
And boy, was there bad blood between those two guys.
Yeah, and the Southerners were dominated obviously by the Democratic Party, and there was a lot of, it was a very divided nation between the North and the South. Because the North was so much larger, election after election, the Republicans were winning. So basically what happened was that there was a split between Taft and Roosevelt, and the Republican Party split. And Woodrow Wilson was only able to win because of
the last guy standing.
Yeah.
To this day, I am told that historians argue over whether or not Teddy Roosevelt took more votes away from the Republican progressives or from the Democratic progressives.
Republican progressives.
You think the answer is Republican?
Absolutely. I mean,
Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I guess it wasn't very discussed. What they draw parallels to is kind of like the 2000 election, like how there was like multiple people running and like three. So like when you have something like that, it's very hard to see like who's going to be stealing the votes from what side. And I guess from what like we see, it's that although it wasn't very discussed, I feel like Teddy Roosevelt, being a Republican, I believe, I guess like. I'm not very sure, honestly.
It was a confusing election. I'm not surprised that it doesn't step out. But we're going to kind of like speed our way through here. Woodrow Wilson elected.
42% of the vote.
And
that was it.
A minority-ish president, but he won the Electoral College.
Easily won the Electoral College.
So he's up to his second term. He kept us out of war. Right? That was World War I is raging in Europe. He's got on a ticket of he kept us out of war. And the suffragists, the good women of that period, changed that to he kept us out of suffrage. Something was happening while World War I was in progress on two fronts. Philosophically, a sign that women marchers outside the White House carried. One particularly irritating sign. Signs like this would never make it. They're too long. But here it is. I'm going to read it exactly. It was, Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten how you sympathized with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 25 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye. So
we can
practically,
laugh about it now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, practically, you have a very strong argument. Mr. Wilson, women's suffrage, get with it. You're fighting for democracy. Philosophically, it's there. Practically, Jean Preuss, tell us what goes on when the men go off to war. What happens to the women?
It's a historical truism. Throughout history, during times of war, women have always see their rights expand. Now, they often contract later on. Excuse me, but because
it's only out of necessity, though.
It's out of necessity.
Yes.
So the question is how long can that be sustained, and can you keep those doors open?
Is that what happened, David? Is that what happened?
That's what happened. I mean,
during World War I.
If you take the young men and their soldiers, and you send them off to war, somebody has to take care of the infrastructure of the country. And they turn and say, well, women, we really need for you to do this now. Get out of the role that you are in and do this. And so it's not a matter of choice or freedom that these women did it. It was a matter of necessity. And so when the war is over, they say, well, let's go back to the way it was before. And they don't really ask, do you want to continue to do this? No, we want to put you back to where you were.
But also,
Yes,
we
sir.
can't look at this in isolation, because if you look at what was going on in Great Britain at the time, you had a very active and actually much more militant women's suffrage movement than what we had in the United States. And I wonder if that may have influenced the American presidential politics, is they didn't want it to get to the point that it had gotten in England.
I'm going to ask a question of each of you and go around the table. President Wilson did, of course, change his mind. And while he was off in Paris, May 1919, he sent a telegram to the United States. And this was his message to Congress. Every consideration of justice and public advantage calls for the immediate adoption of the suffrage amendment. Ta-da. Was it a political calculation, or did he see the light?
I think he saw the light on a level. I mean, I think his marriage to Edith made him see the light more. I mean,
His second wife,
his
Edith.
second wife, yeah, and he married her during his presidency.
Ellen died of Bright's
his first
disease,
wife died,
which was
yes.
kidney disease.
Yes, and Edith's
A year
first
later,
husband had died also. So they were both widowers, and they met, and he pursued her very quickly after his wife died. And I think she had a major influence on him. So I would say it wasn't just political expediency, but it was, I think, a change in his thoughts. A change in, okay, I see myself in this woman's position. What is going on? So politically, it wasn't expedient for him to be for women's suffrage during the election. But later on down the line, as time moved and public opinion moved, the war was over, he realized, okay, now's the time where we have an opening. And at first the opening was, let's just leave it to the states and let the states decide for themselves. But as time went on and he saw that the amendment was a possibility, he jumped in and started to lobby Congress to get this done.
Well, he also, because he wanted the women to vote for prohibition.
Okay, go with that.
Well, prohibition was a big issue, too much drinking, and a lot of that was anti-immigrant driven. In the late 1800s, more and more immigrants are coming into the United States, coming in from places like Southern Europe. So they were Catholic, Jewish, and other Southern and Eastern European faiths and people. Italians.
Different drinking
So different
traditions.
drinking, in Texas even.
He's a Presbyterian.
You have about as many bars and breweries then as you do today. However, so everybody was thinking that too many people were drinking, and there were all of these. If you go back and you read, you probably saw this in your books in school. If you go back and read the literature against demon rum, which actually had started in the 1830s, it had just steamrolled, so that by the early 1900s, there were all these lurid and scandalous stories, and a lot of them made up, about the evils of drink and drinking at work and drinking and people spending all their money working, spending all their money and coming home, and they live destitute lives, and they tied it to poverty. And so this was a way of getting better people, right, by improving the character.
Even if they were women.
Even if women, but the promise that women, being good domestic minded in their sphere of influence, going back to that, women's role as caretakers and as women were the moral compass of the nation. Women had, you as a woman would have raised the children. You were the teacher of the children. And so the morality of the child was in your hands. And so women were seen as a moral compass. And that's why, well, by golly, if we want to cut back on the drink, the men aren't going to do it, but the women will.
Count on the women. Sarah, do you think that President Wilson changed his mind in the matter of women's suffrage as a political expediency or as a moral imperative?
I believe it was most likely both. Like he mentioned, it was having to do with seeing his new wife, I would say, or his second wife, and seeing how she was a widow, how she basically had to handle things on her own, I guess. Although she hired people to do a lot of the things that her husband had left her to do. but also seeing, I guess, like a political strategy, like they are the future. Let's see what
Might
else.
as well go with it.
Yeah, might as well like.
Do you think that he was quite distracted by post-World War I Europe, remaking the world? Do you think that had anything to do with it? Any of you think, Sarah, do you think that had something to do with that he was willing to let it slide, let the issue of women's suffrage kind of play out to its natural progression? Because he was really busy redrawing maps.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it would have happened a lot sooner if it wasn't because of the World War.
Priority shifting.
Yeah, because like trying to pass like the 14 points, trying to like make the League of Nations become, or the United States join the League of Nations, that definitely was his priority, I would say. But if it wasn't because of the war, I don't think that women's suffrage would have even been an issue, because women weren't taking in the roles of men. So seeing that they could handle the jobs that men could handle definitely made women's suffrage a bigger issue following World War I.
Yeah, yeah. Just to finish up the story, the 19th Amendment did pass. Mr. Wilson instructed his Secretary of State, Bainbridge Corby, who I think Mr. Colby was probably very busy with other things, being Secretary of State, but he literally dropped everything to get this signed. And it wasn't so easy to do because there were some questions in the several states about rescinding ratification. Mr. Colby could have sat on this for at least a year, but under the President Wilson's direction, he wanted women to vote in the election of 1920 quickly. Remember, this was the end of August. The election is in November. The candidates were already chosen. Things had to move fast. The 19th Amendment was proclaimed to be the law of the land, and women did indeed vote in that election. In the few minutes we have left, I want to take a philosophical interlude. How do we evaluate people like Woodrow Wilson? His multiple stands on women's suffrage. How do we evaluate anyone of the past? The arc of history bends, time moves on, but it does not move on for those people who have long since gone off to their final reward. They don't have the opportunity to benefit from new evidence, from new events, and to be persuaded by current philosophies. What is our duty to these people? Bearing in mind that someday someone will judge us in a similar fashion. Professor Branham, how do we evaluate people? What are we to think of people?
Well, I do have strong opinions about historical figures. So I think about this a lot. I have a lot of conversations with Dr. Preuss. We disagree on some things, but I thoroughly enjoy the conversations. I think the most important thing that you need to do is evaluate somebody in the context of their time, what they were facing. What we see today is not what they saw. What we know today is not what they knew. And actually, they probably knew a few things that we don't know today. So you have to evaluate in the context of time and see a person, as, making a decision or doing things, and their actions are based on, okay, what did they do to help mankind? And when you get right down to it, that's the most important thing.
On that basis, are you an admirer of Woodrow Wilson?
I am, because he evolved over time, right? He said, okay, this is the way he was. We know the way he was when he was young, and as time went on and he learned things, he changed. Okay, and I think his motive, to me, the motive is the most important thing. The motive was to do what was best. And sometimes he thought doing what was best was holding these people down. And as time went on, he started seeing, oh no, this is not the best way. So maybe I need to change. And I think that's most important.
Sarah?
I would have to agree. If we try to just look at every person from history in the perspective or in the context of today's society, we would probably pin everyone to be evil, a horrible person, totally bad, thinking badly about them. But like you said, it's very important to look at things through context of how things were back then, and mainly evaluating people by how they progressed over time, not necessarily what opinions did they hold and what did they do to keep society stagnant, and more seeing what they did to progress society, to make it more into what we have today.
Are you an admirer of Woodrow Wilson?
I would say I am. I admire his very strong attempt to make the League of Nations part of the United States.
Yeah. Jean Preuss?
That's a good question. So When I was in college, I was intrigued by Woodrow Wilson because of his progressive ideas and because of his actions and the laws that he signed into being. There was a historian named Arthur Link who wrote many books on Woodrow Wilson. And one of my other professors said, you know, Link has kind of adopted Woodrow Wilson. In fact, he wore the same glasses, cut his hair in a similar fashion, and kind of looked a lot like Woodrow Wilson. And I think that's people, we kind of look for heroes in the past. We tend to paint history like we do novels, right? Black and white. There's good guys, there's bad guys, good women, bad women, heroes and villains. But people are much more complex. Times are much more complex than that. So Woodrow Wilson, a racist, a segregationist, but at the same time, he had some great ideas. He was probably believed in things that today we think are bad, just like, as you were mentioning very astutely, that 100 years from now, people are going to look back at us and say, I can't believe those people believe that. And we think we're progressive. We think we're cutting edge. But time is going to judge us much differently than we think it's going to judge us.
Do you admire Woodrow Wilson?
I think he did a lot of good things. I think he was human. I think that he...
On balance, you admire?
I admire him, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting guy, and an interesting progression of views on women's suffrage. But again, it was his administration that saw the dawn of a new age for women voters. Jean Price, David Branham, Sarah Sanchez, thank you so much for joining us this evening as we explore the life and philosophy of President Woodrow Wilson. I'm going to take just a second to remind Harris County voters that there's a significant election coming up on Saturday, August the 25th, a Harris County Flood Control District bond election to raise money for flood control improvements. Find your polling details at www.harrisvotes.com, and to learn about the measure, visit our website, www.lwvhouston.org. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Linda Cohn with the League of Women Voters. Take good care, and we'll chat again soon.